Hello and welcome back to the Berlin Tribunal. We now reach the 5th hearing of the day and the 8th hearing of our tribunal, which is also our last one. And it is a topic which has been discussed in a previous Permanent People's Tribunal in London. But now we're going to talk about it again because it's very important and it's especially urgent in times of COVID-19 and very high inequality and injustices. And the topic of the hearing 8 is the migrant workers' rights. We will have testimonies and statements from organizations working in the UK, in Spain, and also in France and in Germany. And our first speaker will be on Zoom. And they will present on the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on workers, those with problematic immigration status, and on migrant communities. And first speaking will be Angie Garcia, then Waling, together with the PPT London Steering Group UK. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the organizer of this Permanent People's Tribunal hearing here in Berlin. It is a big task. We know that from our own experience in London in November 2018. Thank you also for allowing me to speak about how the COVID-19 is affecting the member of my organization. If one of our members is a single mother with a 5-year-old son, and March, her employer asked her not to come to her house. She was a live-out domestic worker because of the virus. Eve didn't have any savings, so she approached our organization. Her landlord was insisting she pay her rent or she would evict her. She had no money for food and her son was always crying and hungry. We were able to support Eve, but there are thousands more in the same situation. Because they are undocumented, they cannot access to any of the services like money for rent, food, and all the other things you need to keep safe during the time of the COVID-19. This creates a lot of worry and stress for them, and we are experiencing many with mental health issues, now like depression, severe anxiety, and nervousness. I will give a background of our organization when we had a visa that contradicted our status as workers in the United Kingdom. Then I will mention about winning of our rights as workers, and finally, the impact of those rights being denied in April 2012 and our requests to the PPT. During the year 1980-1987, many migrant domestic workers came to the United Kingdom accompanied by their employers and was given a visitor's visa with no rights to work, even though the very reason they were with their employers was to work to the private household. At that time, migrant domestic workers were not recognized as workers. With the help of the CFMW, or the Commission for Filipino Migrant Workers in the United Kingdom, and local parish priests in London, they had a center that served as a sanctuary for all the migrant domestic workers. Waling was founded in 1984, a self-help group. All members were undocumented and came from different nationalities. We were a diverse group, but we had one thing in common. most of us had suffered very bad experiences in the household of our employer. CFMW facilitated the organization and gave us space to have our meeting and able to support each other and to learn more about our rights. We didn't have any legal rights, but we have moral rights as human beings and as workers. In 1987, CFMW, Waling, and other organizations set up Kalayaan, meaning freedom, to campaign publicly to end this system of slavery. That is, tying domestic workers to their employer. The TGW, or the Transport General Workers Union, now Unite the Union, and many other similar organizations was working and campaigning with us to have domestic work and the private household recognized as work. It was a high-profile campaign. We fought over 10 years until in 1997. We won our campaign, our rights to be recognized as workers in the United Kingdom. Domestic workers visa was introduced for all incoming workers accompanying their employers. Migrant domestic workers coming in the UK had a visa that recognized them as workers, and they have the same right as all other workers, providing they kept certain conditions attached to their visa. Example, that they would work full-time in the private household, renewed their visa every year for 5 years, then they could apply for settlement in the United Kingdom. Domestic workers had same right as any workers, like that is to have a contract, including hours of work, salaries, day off, holidays with pay, pension, and paying national insurance. And over 4,000 migrant domestic workers were given a legal status with the right to settlement and the right to change employer. However, in 2012, the government withdrew all the rights won by the migrant domestic workers in 1997. Since then, migrant domestic workers accompanying their employers are given a non-renewable 6 months visa. This was so shocking to remove hard-won rights from workers and leaving them extremely vulnerable and without any protection. In this short span of time, many suffered abuse at the hands of their employer. You will have heard from Francis Weber, yesterday's speaker, about the hostile environment in the UK. It is difficult for migrants and refugees to survive. This is the constant threat of imprisonment. There is a constant threat of imprisonment, deportation, and serious labor exploitation. The best protection for migrant domestic workers is to restore the rights of the domestic workers' visa. Since COVID-19 started, life has been unbearable for many undocumented migrants. Many are now experiencing mental health difficulties and are barely surviving, coping with sickness, and often going hungry. The pandemic has had catastrophic effect. The migrant domestic workers lost their work and income. Some were relying on charity, friends, or informal loans. Undocumented migrant domestic workers are most affected. They had no formal tenancy agreement. They could not benefit from the government imposed ban on eviction. They live in a poor and more crowded place on neighborhood, often in multiple occupation houses, sharing bedroom, kitchen, and bathroom with others. Employers of the live-in migrant domestic workers canceled all the works and problems of paying the rents, and they struggle to live, and daily life is really a big problem. And most of all, access to healthcare is extremely difficult. They're obliged to show valid documents, or they will be charged very high fees for medical assistance. An undocumented person in the United Kingdom will be charged 150% more than the cost of their treatment for surgery or other medical needs. They can reach to thousands of pounds for any procedure. This is very frightening, for the worst are those who need hospitalization, because they are asked to sign a form saying they will repay the cost of their treatment. I have an example, and we knew one woman who has a serious heart condition and was treated in the hospital and given a bill of £9,000. This caused her a lot of stress. Fortunately, doctors of the ward helped her by writing to the hospital and offering that she would pay £50 a month, although it is very hard for her because of her ongoing heart condition. It is difficult for her to get back to work. But we have learned how powerful organized undocumented migrant workers can be. Waling wants justice for all migrant workers and refugees, and demand respect for the work we do. We must be recognized as workers, and domestic work and the private household recognized as work, and along with the Permanent People's Tribunal, London steering groups, and other organizations, we are beginning to organize a new campaign for all undocumented people. We strongly reject that United Kingdom or any member country of the European Union can violate our rights as women, as migrants, and as workers. We demand a legal status for all. Let us build a new Europe-wide campaign. We ask the Permanent People's Tribunal or Permanent People's Tribunal to recognize our rights and our struggle for our rights as workers. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your input. Now we will listen to another input testimony on the situation of domestic workers in Madrid, and that will be done from Giulia Jorrego. I hope that I pronounced your name correctly. and she will represent SEDOAC Surface and the Lab Trade Union. I hope that I pronounced that correctly.
Buenas tardes, soy Carolina
Good
Elías,
afternoon. I'm Carolina Elias,
representante de la
a
Asociación
representative of the Active Domestic Service or Servicio Doméstico Activo. SEDOAC.
Hola, sí, soy de SEDOAC, de la Asociación de
Hi, I'm in
Empleados
SEDOAC, the Madrid
Ha habido un error con
domestic
el nombre de Giuila
workers.
Jauregui, que ha
There's
sido
a mistake with the name.
esto, pero quien
Julissa Jauregui interviewed us, but the person who's representing the organization is me, Carolina
no sé
Elias.
si me dan paso para
Could you
hablar.
say, do you mind if I start talking?
Okay, muchísimas
Okay,
gracias
thank
en primer
you very
lugar por
much
esta oportunidad
for this
de
chance of making visible a situation of discrimination and clear denial of fundamental human rights, and particularly migrant women who work in doing housework and doing care work, not just in Spain but in the whole world. Caring for life is so important everywhere, but even many years back, before this coronavirus situation, we had suffered discrimination because of a lack of recognition of our rights compared to other workers in Spain. And we think that the situation began first because we're mainly women. Most of us who do these kind of tasks are women, and particularly we're migrant women. And this puts us at more in a situation of greater vulnerability. And we'd like Europe and the whole world to know the terrible situation that thousands of women in doing domestic work have had during the state of emergency in particular and the whole COVID experience. We've been closed into the homes that we work in because of the confinement. We didn't even have the right to look after our own families. They were actually preventing us from having breaks that we'd won through our struggles in the past. We were again to longer working days and working weeks. We were even working Saturday and Sunday. Workloads were multiplied because we were looking after the whole family inside the homes we worked in, and we couldn't even have time to have a break. The emotional stress that these women workers have suffered has just added to all the other stress that all families felt. So everybody was stressed out because of COVID, but we had this additional stress. We were confined. Imagine it would have been bad enough just to be confined in our own houses or locked down, but we were locked down in our workplace. Imagine how difficult that was, not even being able to give your body a rest. That situation of stress which the family accumulated often sometimes came of the families we work with, sometimes was passed on to us. There were anger towards there was comrades and sisters who suffered violence from their employers. Sorry, imagine how much more home workers suffered when they're closed behind these four walls and not having any support to be able to escape from this both physical and emotional violence that they were suffering. I just want to mention a colleague who was hired to look after an elderly person, but she had to stay. She had to stay the weekends to look after that person.
tenían que remunerarse.
Normally, if you do overtime, you should get paid overtime.
Las hijas de la
The
persona
daughters of the elderly person have refused to pay that money. They paid no overtime. She called for a decent wage, and the only thing she received was actual physical assault. They took a stick, the mop stick, and they chased her onto the street. And this woman went to the police station because she was beaten by them, and she had signs of the blows that the daughter of the elderly man had given her. The surprise was that after she filled in the report at the police station, the policeman said that he was going to carry out the process to expel her from the country because she didn't have the right residence permit to be there. She didn't have a residence permit according to the police, and that was his response. Look at this situation of this complete lack of protection that such workers have. And they don't denounce their low wages because they're scared about being sacked. We know that there's massive unemployment in the whole of Spain. But in the case of the home workers, we are not just, we don't just need the payment for our costs in Spain, but also we send money back to our families in our countries of origin. And it's an incredible stress to the street and looking for new work and not being able to pay all of the bills and accepting these jobs, even though they're low paid, because they need that wage. Absolutely, it's of absolute necessity. There are employers who don't want to sign documents saying that they are traveling, so that the home workers would not get fined during the confinement because the police were doing checks and the women would need to show documents that they were going to work in order to not be fined. But actually employers didn't want to give them those documents. They weren't given gloves and masks. It was assumed that they had to be in those homes. They sometimes even locked them in. They were practically prisoners in the family homes. Unfortunately, the government did not introduce the necessary means to protect those workers. We have a legal framework which doesn't even give us the recognition and rights that we need for basic rights to be able to defend ourselves in court cases. For this reason, we are demanding the Spanish government to adopt the necessary measures in order to protect home workers or household workers. We're not just demanding that, but we are demanding also that they can let us to continue to work, but under fair conditions, the kind of conditions that we should have. And we also ask for society to value the work we do. So we are asking this tribunal to make a very energetic and strong demand against the lack of protection that we have and the xenophobia that we're suffering, us home working women or domestic working women. The state has not guaranteed our right to access to healthcare, both healthcare and mental healthcare. We are there suffering the danger of being contaminated by this disease. We are not being given the protective equipment that we need to protect ourselves. We cannot continue to work that way. So we're asking the tribunal to condemn all of these actions and to call on the Spanish state to ratify the ILO's 89 convention, which means adopting a legal framework where workers have equal rights with compared to other workers, so that us domestic workers have this right to unemployment benefit, which is a right which we've been denied in this country and other workers.
Pedimos
We
también
ask also that this tribunal calls for the abolition
régimen de
of the internment regime, which is the form of work by which, sorry, this is not the internment, this is the internal regime where we work inside homes and live there. So we're not just working an 8-hour day, we're working the whole day because we never leave our workplace. Doesn't allow us workers to have our own life outside and look after and form our own family and look after our own family. It is a form of slavery. We ask this tribunal to call on the Spanish state to bring in the public policies and measures needed so domestic workers can pay have their social security covered by their employers. We are asking the tribunal to call on the Spanish government to regularize all of the people that are in the country irregularly so that we can continue working in this country with freedom and peacefully, but with rights. We would be really grateful. We are really grateful that this tribunal is listening to us and giving visibility to such an essential job as the job we're doing, the domestic work. Thank you very much.
Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon.
Agradecemos el espacio. ¿Se oye?
Really grateful for having the chance.
Agradecemos el espacio que desde Permanente de los Pueblos han facilitado para el sindicato LAB poder presentar la que hacemos en nombre
the LAB union, to talk about the situation of domestic labourers, also talking in the name of the grain organization in the Basque Country, and we're denouncing the lack of that there are to fight against exploitation of domestic workers, and we are making claims on the government of the Basque and the Spanish government. We want to insist a lot on the way we've been abandoned and the lack of rights to justice that our collective has. There are many legal holes which allow us to be treated in a discriminatory way. We don't have the right to maternity, and we don't have other rights. We suffer many kinds of violence. There is avoiding legal responsibility towards us when we are doing care. Care is something that always falls on the bodies of us female domestic workers. We are those that do care work, and 98% of that collective are migrant women. It is going to talk about domestic workers in Euskal Herria or the Basque Country. We're suffering all kinds of oppressions. We are considered as a second-class group of workers. Particularly hard is the situation of the internal domestic workers, ones who live in or live-in workers who are invisible. And we are precarious labour sectors in the Basque Country. There has been a special regime applied in the Basque Country. The attitude of the unions mainly directed towards workers who are inside the general regime. And this collective is marginalized from that. Until 1995, there wasn't even recognized the statute of workers for this collective. We suffer violence and discrimination in the Basque Country. There are women who are racialized,
a
and
base de opresiones
who have been able to build things despite oppression. They have become a fundamental pillar of care workers' organizations in the Basque Country. We'd like to thank them for that. In Euskal Herria,
46.300 trabajadoras.
45,000 domestic workers. We don't have specific or detailed data because there is a lot of lack of data or of a real kind.
Es que se enfrascan
That is the situation we're in, and
de economía sumergida. Por
they
tanto,
fall into the underground economy. The law of workers, domestic workers, is not included in some of the regimes that exist.
en la seguridad social,
Only 20,000 workers in this sector are registered for the social security. Of these, 28,000 in the Basque region or nation
pero
are included in certain statistics, but actually in practice, we have 46,600 workers, domestic workers are working in our. We do not have enough resources for care, and Spain is one of the countries, one of the most one of the developed countries with the highest number of domestic work, and it's always been above average. And in 2007, it's normally 300,000 was spent, and in the Basque Country we spend a lot more than that, 400,000. This is spent on the sector. The reality of domestic workers is so precarious, and we don't even know very detailed, don't even have very detailed knowledge on their labour situation. Their realities become oppressions. They are workers who do not appear anywhere. They are becoming, their rights are violated. They do not have protections. Their vulnerability, it leads them to be defenseless. Faced with the people who hire them. We shouldn't forget that this sector is not unionized, that their workplace is, so there isn't a kind of employer organization, and there's no kind of system of delegates for workers in order to negotiate with them. Unions have been far from being a useful organization to help them organize. Domestic workers have found historically they have the capacity to create alliances and also organizations to defend their interests. Domestic workers are seen as second-class citizens and are in practice having second-class rights. Structurally, they received minimum wages, they work very long hours. In legal terms, the regulations allow up to 60 hours of work a week, which means that they work 40 ordinary face-to-face hours and other hours they do on top of that. This is considered, or we understand that the legislature omits the night hours that we do. It doesn't take that into account when it enforces minimums. We're not being paid for the real time that we are working. We can find workers in precarious situations who work per hour or who do endless hours, both in the Basque Country and the rest of Spain, and the Spanish state. The statute of workers is not applied because this collective has a special regime which actually makes its conditions precarious. In most cases, this regime is not even applied, and people earn less than the minimum in the law. They are very easy to hire and very easy to exploit. There is this famous aliens law which makes it easier to exploit people. It condemns migrant workers for 3 years until they can become legally resident.
que están sin permiso de trabajo o lo tan
If you
mencionado
don't
papel,
have
las condena
a
a
work
un tiempo de
permit,
silencio,
and
de
you are
miedo,
condemned
porque
to
su vida
silence
es
and
amedrentada,
fear,
y sobre
you
todo
are
no
scared,
se reconocen sus
and your
derechos,
rights are not
porque se
recognized,
piensa
and
que
you
no
think
pueden
that
denunciar.
you can't
La
complain,
vulneración de
you
derechos
can't make a
ocurre con
formal
mucha
complaint about your
frecuentidad
condition.
en los casos de trabajadoras con este perfil. En esto, es estructural. No son casos aislados. En Euskal
We are not
Herria,
talking about isolated cases in the Basque country. Violence is generalized, and a collective response needs to be given, and a political response needs to be given.
Trabajadoras de hogar internas, en su mayoría, son mujeres migradas. Debido a la indefensión que
We
padecen,
are migrant workers generally, and we're part of an organization which has terrible conditions.
condiciones laborales por el hecho de ser mujeres migradas. Si hablamos de la vulneración de derechos, es importante mencionar la ausencia de contratos o la violación de contratos laborales.
We cannot hear you.
¿Continúo?
Sí,
¿Sí? No sé a qué se refiere.
sí.
Vale.
The lack or absence of contracts is also worth mentioning.
Hablamos del contrato laboral o más bien de la
Working contract, so the lack of a real contract is worth mentioning, a contract that will be respected.
el salario que se tiene
The
estipulado
wages
salario mínimo interprofesional, ya que
as
la
the
mayoría
considered minimum wages, because most of them, about 95% of those workers,
el valor real
are not receiving the real value
todo esto
of the working day.
entre más horas se reporte, menos cantidad
The more hours they are reporting,
pago tiene que hacer el empleador, la parte empleadora.
the less payment the employer will have to give them. Also, it must be mentioned that they are not entitled to unemployment benefits, it is not contemplated that we, as domestic workers, will renounce or be benefited from them, and it's only the word given to the employer that counts. Is extensive working hours, the lack of breaks or rest for those internal stay in, as well as the ongoing 36 rest hours for rest. The sleeping in workers is making this much harder, and they are using the excuse of the unviability of households, and they are not being recognized as a working context for inspections. Work health is inexistent for domestic workers, and even less for stay-in workers. Abuses are constant in different situations where mainly women are exposed to.
Bonjour à toutes et tous. Je me présente, je suis Émilie Loison.
Good morning, my name is Émilie Loison. I'm in the south of France.
Au sein du mouvement paysan international, la Via Campesina,
We are part of a movement called La Via Campesina. We are committing to the defense of migrants' rights in a context of a health crisis. We addressed a letter to the European Parliament since the world economy needs the working class in order to function. globalized market is creating a competition among the workers in all the world, in all the earth. So their goal is to divide us so that they will keep on being in charge. So they are promoting poverty so that there will be an industrial culture that will depend on slavery work. Applying the free trade agreements, the populations are only left with immigration and they can accept any condition in order not to starve to death. We can denounce the case denounced by the Italian trade union, the case of Benami Ahmed, a Senegalese who was born alive in a ghetto where he was obliged to live in a place where the rights of migrants is not recognized. There are another case of a worker in France collecting apples, and she was asphyxiated in a car because of insufficient ventilation. The transportation and commercialization of food was not accompanied by adequate measures nor enough resources for these groups. Immediate profit was prioritized over the basic needs of people. The pressures exerted were important and are still important. Working times become longer. It's now 60 hours per week, and the rights were reduced, have been reduced. Firing people is now become very easy. Working permits are now no longer letting people access health services. Not all have been regularized, and in any case, only those who are explicitly needed for some work at a specific moment are receiving regularization. In Romania, for example, there was a flexibilization of the laws with regards to the staff and the workers working in slaughterhouses in Germany. They tried finding local workers, but the conditions are so bad. Only people in extreme vulnerability would accept. So they were people in situation of precariousness. Therefore, it was the migrants who finally accepted this kind of work. In Provence, in France, some clusters were spotted, but they were difficult to spot because the workers themselves didn't even know where they were locked without any health protocol, and according to the law, they should have been ensured fresh produce and food, but this is not something that was respected. So a citizen movement was organized among the neighbors to defend their rights. Another case in France, the supposed country of human rights, was the Arles case, where 5 workers were working for Laboral Terra, and this case was what took place in Arles. It was a lawsuit where the company was sued for failing to pay the extra hours to the workers, the breaks, illegal retention of salary, and the non-obtention of medical visits. It was also acknowledged the temporary workers were not granted social benefits because the temporary workers company that was hiring them declared itself in bankruptcy. They didn't accept the accusations or the indictments regarding their illegal stay in an organized band and the negotiation, as well as the illicit loaning of working force, was at stake. We're talking about local workers, so it should be under the European Union directive. The national march in France for solidarity with the people without papers from 18th September from Marseille, marching from Marseille, was marching towards Paris against police violence, against state racism and those migrants and their families. And it was focalized in the popular neighborhoods, and youth for justice and liberty, against exception laws and for this asylum and immigration law draft, a pilot scheme to be cancelled because these worked the role, and the first of them to be exploited were these workers themselves. In every sector, they are on the first line. This national march was supported by different organizations in favor of the regularization of all illegal workers and in favor of the closing of internment centers. Solidarity Refuge of Briançon has been threatened with closure. It is welcoming more of 11,000 migrants thanks to a petition by the citizens. The closing of the center has been delayed for 6 months. The associations of citizens, the citizens organizations and the trade unions are criticizing the hypocrisy of the state attitude, and they are trying to make these migrant workers who are invisible working on the land. They are asking for this dignity to be given back to them because it wasn't negotiable in the first place.
Okay. Entonces, primero agradecer.
So I just want to thank my colleagues who just did a very complete presentation about the domestic workers who really deserve our solidarity, our trade union, Lucian, trade union for field workers. So, and our trade union includes almost all sectors. We know, and it has been repeated, that the field is the engine of the nutrition for Europe. Here in Almeria, we've got more than 120,000 field workers working to feed the population in Germany and in other parts of Europe. They're working under very bad conditions. And when this pandemic arrived, our fight was only against the convention and the invisibility of the foreign undocumented workers, because workers are still very poor in the so-called first world, which is Europe. So when we enter the state of alarm, Mr. Sanchez, the president of the Spanish government said that the social shield would not leave anybody behind. We had hope and faith in that this left-wing government wouldn't leave us behind and would help us sort, but we only received bills.
Muchos compañeros acaban de llegar, no hablan el español, a veces les cuesta leer, escuchar y entender lo que es un decreto.
Police shields, and they said that black people would be immune from coronavirus, so they couldn't be infected. Not long ago, a Romanese guy received a 1,000 euro fine for not wearing his mask. So everything that the government has spent in order to sustain us has been asking us to pay in return. We, who are the people without culture, the ignorant ones, people who have come by contract, they were blocked during the whole pandemic months. Someone who didn't even get paid a decent wages that were enough for survival anyway was blocked. They didn't have any support. Not even a place to live. And they are supposed to eat from that money? Until not long ago, where boats took them to Morocco. So in Almeria and Mija, a municipality in our Almeria province, a lot of our colleagues have been living among plastics. Living in shacks, have not been benefited by the government in any other way. They have not received any money, they have not received any benefits. They supposedly received support, but this money never got to these colleagues, they never arrived. These colleagues are trying to find a healthy environment. They will never find all that is being offered to us. Is orders to wear masks. They don't have drinking water and when the lockdown was strongest, we've seen some colleagues who came out of their house and they were fined. That's all they got. The United Nations rapporteur said something that was very strong. Philip Alston, I think that's his name. He said they were living in much worse conditions than in a refugee camp, and he was talking about workers, people who should have the freedom of choosing a place to live. They don't, because they are foreign people, because there is a law, a foreign law, like my colleague from the lab trade union was saying, that was reducing and is making them invisible all along. Currently, these contracts have multiplied by fourfold. Nothing legal is given to them. The boss can do whatever he wants with them. Migrants from Latin America speak Spanish, and that's a bit different from them. Those who come from sub-Saharan Africa, from the Maghreb, come to Europe but without speaking Spanish, they can't defend themselves. They are left vulnerable for 20 years. We haven't seen any change, any positive change towards it. We are used to having a permanent people's tribunal, but these things come back and they are not solved. We are under the kingdom of impunity, and with the pandemic, we have been taken further away from the administrative centers. We have been taken further away from health. If they have the flu, say, even if it's a serious flu, you come close to a health center, you have to call, and they won't even pick up the phone. For an unemployment benefit, they have to make a phone call, but a lot of our colleagues are not able to do that. And the government seems to be blind, and deaf at this screams, shouts of alarm. We're agonizing. We are dying now because the pandemic has been added on to what already was there, what we were already suffering. Permanent abuses are. When you open your mouth, you're thrown out in the cold streets. The only trade union that is dealing with this, with the exploiter, is a small Andalusian trade union in Almeria, but they are pointing their finger at us. They know who we are. Thank you. Thanks, yes, I know I have 5 minutes left. So, really, the tribunal should focus their attention on these centers of industrial agriculture, as Emily said. Governments, politicians don't dare speak much because it depends on this. They depend on these exploiters' votes. I can't vote myself. How are my protests useful to these governors, politicians? Is it more useful for them to support the field workers? Why should they listen to their claims? So I would like to thank you for this space that is at least allowing us to exchange what is happening and to express our uneasiness and our discomfort with the situation. Maybe I have forgotten something, but thank you for leaving me this space. Yes. Not Sunny, Spitu. 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 Spitu.
My name is Spito. Now we understand
each other.
Thank you for your contributions. We would now take the time and would ask our online participants, our jury in present, to ask some questions to the people who just presented. Are there any questions? Then please raise your hand.
Pregunta.
Yes?
Yo levanto la mano, pero no me veo en la pantalla, así que... Sí, no sé por qué.
Yes, it's
I
working.
put up my hand, but I don't appear in the screen. I think that's coming out black. Anyway, my question is for the colleague from the lab union. They have talked about internal work. I thought this kind of domestic work had been abolished. I didn't think it existed anymore. So I'd like to know to what extent is this common in Spain, and how can those workers defend themselves
usted
from,
de una clase de esclavitud, ¿no? Más o
because
menos.
they're getting close to a class of
Eso del
a case of slavery.
Gracias.
And I'm talking about the internal, the actual live-in domestic work.
Definitivamente el trabajo de
Yes,
hogar,
the
sobre todo para las
working in
compañeras
the
que
home
trabajan en el
for
régimen
colleagues
interno,
that
es
work
una de
live-in
nuestras demandas,
is
al
something
igual
that we
que
have
la
demands
compañera de
about.
SEDOAC
As our colleague from SEDOAC
estamos
mentioned,
solicitando
we
que
are
se
calling
extinga, que se
for this
elimine,
kind of
que
category to stop
este régimen porque
existing,
vulnera
because this
al
regime
máximo
fully violates
condiciones laborales y sobre todo la
labor condition, and particularly the
las mujeres.
individuality of people, and particularly women, because as she mentioned very well,
Limita
our colleague,
el poder
it limits the ability to have life
personas y
projects and
desarrollarnos
to develop ourselves as people.
para las trabajadoras
The working
muchas
day for living
entre 80 y hasta 90
workers is around 80 or 90 hours a week.
no contempla
Does not take into
el
account
sueño,
any
el poder
breaks, does not take into account sleeping and
que al
resting,
estar dentro del
because
hogar
it understands that because you're in a house,
de
you are
tu empleador
available to your
recae sobre la
employer.
trabajadora la responsabilidad
This puts the responsibility on the worker of doing care beyond the tasks that they should be doing as a domestic worker, and they can suffer violence.
casos en que la
Of different
trabajadora
kinds. There are many cases where workers
asume de
take on
psicólogo,
being a nurse and being a
de
psychologist, and take on being a social worker, because all of these roles and all of these disciplines are performed by just one person, and many times
¿Cómo defendemos?
these domestic workers have to do this work and also show affection to the people they're working with. So what do? Well,
compañeras,
we need to have contact with our
asociar,
colleagues,
poder defendernos,
be able to defend ourselves together, because a person on their own cannot do anything about their situation. We are atomized. We think we don't have any rights because we are
el último eslabón en la línea de
the
trabajadores.
last step in
Derechos reconocidos
the ladder of
línea
workers in the hierarchy.
Los otros
There are
gremios
other
tienen
groups
sus sindicatos,
workers, unions, and have other organizations, and they have their binding legal agreements, but we don't have the same.
reconocido el derecho a poder
We
manifestar.
don't even have the right to demonstrate. It's not even recognized. During this action, we are being represented by other people, because people who work in homes, domestic workers, cannot actually do a demonstration for ourselves. So we have other people do protest for us. There is nothing that looks to see that any laws in our favor are being applied. Domestic workers are being respected in terms of their physical state.
No, o sea, esto va en escala hasta
But there's a kind of scale of things.
porque las trabajadoras no
We
tienen
have had cases of women being killed, people being killed because they don't have the right to healthcare, and they don't have these basic things. The employer does not fancy recognizing their rights beyond the absolutely most essential ones. They don't even recognize that they have the right to have the other rights, the rights that others have.
y no
Just
facilitan el que
summarized,
las trabajadoras se regularicen.
they don't
No respaldan el que la
help
trabajadora
or give support so the migrant worker can get a residence permit and therefore work permit and have the conditions that other groups of workers benefit from.
Another question to one of, yes?
Hay otra.
thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us and all your efforts on behalf of these vulnerable workers. I have a question for Angie. The loss of rights for domestic workers in the UK was in 2012, as you mentioned, with Prime Minister Cameron. This was prior to Brexit and the most recent wave of anti-immigration in the UK, although I know it has always been there. If I recall correctly, at the time, the public justification for such loss of rights was a fallacious distinction between highly skilled migrants, which were to be prioritized, and the low-skilled ones, which were to be deterred. And I wonder if you could explore this imposed distinction between migrants and what, in your opinion, could be done about it in order to unite the overall struggle for migrants workers and migrants' rights. And also had a question for our contributions from Spain. I can try in Spanish. La situación es muy problemática hace décadas. ¿Qué está pasando con la actual situación política en España ahora con el crecimiento de partidos políticos como el Vox, que tiene una agenda anti-inmigración muy clara? Bueno, ¿cuáles son sus prioridades en términos de ataques que están haciendo vosotras para se defender? Gracias.
Okay. Oh, hi. This is about the, to answer the question. Yes, the government withdrew the rights of the migrant domestic workers in 2012. And you're asking about the difference about the high-skilled and the migrant domestic workers. Well, I can see that mostly of the migrant domestic workers who came to the UK are skilled or highly skilled workers, but because of the situation of applying from their home countries, going to, like, for example, the stepping country is the Middle East, and that's the I think the best route for them to look for, like, for example, better opportunities. So I can say that migrant domestic workers who came to the UK accompanying their employers, some, because of they have this 6 months non-renewable visa, but they are very high skilled. Some of them are nurses, teachers, social workers back home. But these skilled workers, they're not being highly recognized in the United Kingdom. That's why they are just working as a domestic workers. Thank you.
Bien, con respecto a tus en primer lugar, me gustaría hacer una acotación sobre la pregunta anterior y agregar que en la hogar interna estimamos las alrededor de un 45% trabajadoras familias prefieren contratar a una persona a disposición de 24 horas.
46% are living. That's the figure that we estimate.
Euros y no por 8 horas.
And they get the minimum wage, which is just over 900 euros, but they have to work unlimited hours.
Por dos razones. Una, porque no tienen permiso de
for two
trabajo,
reasons.
y
One
dos,
is
porque
because
no hay
they don't have a work permit, and also they're not
respecto a las
registered in the social security. With regards to professional migrant workers and non-professional migrant workers, We have the same problem with migrant workers in Spain as happened in England. It's the same problem. In 2017, there was a study made, and we found that we'd have a much higher percentage of university graduation. We have over 40% among our collective. We are well educated in our countries of origin, but there are many efforts by the government to studies. We have to ratify our studies, and there's a lot of obstacles for this. We found that in the care issue, those that are professional carers and are in a different labour regime system also have unfair and unequal conditions. They still don't have the same rights as other groups of workers. We thought because we are domestic workers, we should become more professional. We should be more recognized as professionals. But what we're seeing is that even the professional carers and those that enter into the agreements affecting those professionals actually also suffer from inequality and the other problems I mentioned. We are hearing lots of racist discourses, but those have been with us for a long time, for many decades. What's the problem now? The problem now is that these people giving these racist discourses have their own microphone and a platform, and that means more people and express the xenophobic ideas that these politicians defend. And these ideas are patent in our society. We stop being seen as workers. We are being seen as the maid, the girl. This is the kind of way that they treat us Latin American and migrant women. They treat us even as a slave and see us as a slave. There's also a lot of sexist discourses which affects us as well. We think it's really important for the tribunal also to take position against sexist ideas. Thank you. I would just add something short. I'd like to give Carol a big hug for the exactitude of your analysis. I'm so, you know, in the screen, I've lost a bit of my calm because I've been moved by what I've heard.
Es decir, los formatos, bueno, puede ser un sueño, podemos seguir luchando. Nosotros, desde que hemos iniciado, ha sido la
auto-organización. We've been self-organizing.
Mejor que los demás les enseñe algo.
We know best how to organize ourselves. We don't need other people to show us how to do it. We've given ourselves a voice. We've said papers for everyone. We've been helping people that don't know where they can get papers. When they need a labour inspector, we've been showing them where they can find a labour inspector. That's exactly what we've been able to show through our self-organisation. There's this idea that the people coming from other countries are illiterate and have no education, and they think that we can't even participate in organisations to defend rights. But our union works in Almeria to integrate us into the collective of foreign workers. And with regards to xenophobia, yesterday, the vote, there was this motion of censorship against the government by Vox, against the centre-left government, and they're using these things as a platform, and they're spreading these discourses against migrants. We can find but at the same time, they want farmers to be able to hire whatever migrants they can. And they threaten us with the law. They threaten us that if we complain, then they can expel us. And this is racism. This is slavery in the 21st century. Thank you.
Perdona, si yo puedo clarificar, lo entiendo que muchas trabajadoras de hogar
many home workers or domestic workers have higher education, but I was asking whether there's kind of different treatment between different collectives in Spain. I.e. qualified and non-qualified migrants.
¿Nos escuchamos?
Can we hear each other? Can we hear each other?
Si hay preferencia, si hay una preferencia
towards
el formado, la formada, la que tiene realmente
educated migrants,
se defiende, aunque realmente sabe decir algo, como lo
able to say not happy with things.
Llega un momento que
invisible, but they can stand up for themselves. But if people don't have any studies, they can be exploited until so hard they could die from it. It's very hard for them to say, boss, I'd like to have a pay rise. I want my documents, etc. That's the difference. That's the difference. But they are also besieged by fear because they don't know about their rights, and after a few hours they it's difficult to get such people because of all of the reasons I've explained to join organizations like ours, but we say we must do it because we cannot accept that in the first world this modern slavery exists. We cannot accept that politicians and employers, salaried with a capitalist salary, exploit us like this. We cannot put up with that.
I would like to ask if there are a few more questions. We can take on one more question or comment, and then we will move on. Yes? You can speak.
Please,
now.
David, you can speak. We hear the voice and we see you.
Yes, I've got to speak in English. I do speak Spanish and French as well, but not so well. So I've been following in languages. Actually, what I was going to bring up was a technical point, because it might be of interest to the judges on the panel. It comes from a background where here in the UK and no doubt in other countries, marginalized people have suddenly become a problem in the pandemic because they were known to exist or became visible because of controls and so on. In the case of the UK, it was mainly asylum seekers and refused asylum seekers. And then in the UK, new initiatives are made to move people en masse into hotels or centers with some kind of limited control, but no cash, etc., etc. But it's really to emphasize the theme of these people who are really outside the awareness of society, generally speaking. And in this context, we came across an immigration rule in the UK, which is based on, and I'm consulting my papers here, EU Council Directive 2001/6 SOC-SAT/55 of 20th of July 2001 to give temporary protection by member states in the event of a mass influx of displaced persons, mass arrival of displaced persons. So it seemed to me that whether or not we have people arriving in big numbers from over the Mediterranean or from the Canary Islands and so on, we have a mass influx because suddenly we are aware of large numbers of people who've been excluded. The idea would be to give a year of temporary protection to people who can be identified in one way or another, which could then be renewed because the pandemic is indeed an emergency situation, and the presence of large numbers of people outside the normal law or awareness of the law is a threat not just to them, a death threat to them, but potentially to other people who are also going to catch the disease from them when they encounter them. So it's to say that we could possibly call for the temporary protection directive to be enacted. Why does this come from Britain? Because Britain didn't have time to exit all the individual rules, and instead it decided to incorporate a great mass of 40 years of European legislation into British law. So I'm quoting from European and British law at the same time. So it's partly a message to judges, but also to suffering people that I hope we can find some concrete solution. Because if at least we had a year of time, that would give time for people to put their reivindicaciones, their demands, and aware of their situation, so that they would then gain actions and admittance into society, in the hope that there are reasonable people, that our society is not 100% made up of the followers of Vox and similar parties in different countries. Thank you very much.
So I also want to thank all of the speakers who have spoken so far in the hearing aid on the migration workers' rights. Thank you to Angie, to Caroline, to Emily, and to Suni. And now we will go to our last contribution to this hearing, which will come from also Oldenburg. It's an association counseling people who lost their work, but they also counseling a lot of people who have difficulties in their life. And they wrote us a statement on the exploitation and discrimination of migrant workers in Germany, and we are very glad that, unfortunately, since no one from also could participate, Giulia Tattarini from the Berlin Migrant Strikers will present their statement. Thank you.
Hello, thank you everybody. I'm Giulia and I'm a member of Berlin Migrant Strikers, a self-organized political collective based in Berlin. As already mentioned, we were asked to read the statement by Also, who cannot be present today. But before starting with the statement, I would like to introduce to you my collective very briefly. We are the Berlin Migrant Strikers. We are migrants in the intra-European context. Our condition of migrants appear to us as existential rather than determined by borders or bureaucratic fences. Our transnationalism and our common condition as migrants do not refer to any national belonging, but rather to a social condition. They are the response to the economic and social crisis of those who, feeling to this metropolis, Berlin, have made an attempt at self-determination. Because we experience every day in our life, we know very well those mechanisms within the fortress Europe. Yeah? Okay, yes, sorry. Okay, so because we experience every day in our life, we know very well the existence of those mechanisms within the fortress Europe, such as the logic of human commodification, of labor commodification, the repression of dissent, and the denial of basic human rights, such as health rights, that have determined and still determine movements beyond our will. Our political practices here in Berlin aim at diffusing this mechanism. We are anti-capitalist because capital exploits our movement, our work, limits our choices, and annihilates our desires. Anti-racism, anti-sexism, and anti-fascism are our boundaries in the dialogue with others. Mutualism, bottom-up cooperation, and participation in migrants' work and struggles present on the metropolitan space are the pillars of our concept of citizenship. We experiment forms of bio-unionism, namely of collective self-organization and solidarity against the violence of capital. Our practices are only collective, and they aim to building and developing relationships that are always inclusive and open, to create collective dynamics and of reappropriation of wealth and rights and spaces, and to experience forms of cooperative and supportive life that cross and spread in the metropolis. All of this can be only achieved starting from our fragmented conditions of migrants, fugitives, invisible, exploited, precarious workers, recomposed under new combinations from the plots of our desire and social conflict, which exist in this metropolitan context as well as elsewhere under the neoliberal capitalist system. United we fight. So now the statement from Also. Those who have to claim social benefits often feel helpless in the face of complicated laws, bureaucratic obstacles, or even the threat of sanctions. Since 1982, the unemployment self-help organization Also, Arbeitslosen Selbsthilfe, Oldenburg, has been offering free and independent help in dealing with the social system that all too often fights the poor instead of poverty. In addition to social counseling for the unemployed and people with low incomes, we have also been offering multilingual migration counseling in the Oldenburg district since 2020. We believe that poverty and unemployment should not be taboo topics that everyone has to deal with on their own. And also, this belief is reflected in our counseling situations. If necessary, we accompany people to their meetings at state departments in order to assert justified claims. Also is also politically committed to improving the living conditions of poor and unemployment people. This includes not only informing people about their rights or demanding more money, but also fighting the stigmatization of poverty. We also work against the exploitation of people, animals, and the environment, as well as against racism and exclusion. We are networking with like-minded people to make demands and raise awareness of our concerns. Also is largely financed by donations, except for a few employees, mainly volunteers are working at Also. We welcome other volunteers and also interns who would like to help with political actions or in the day-to-day consulting business. Contact and further information can be found to their homepage. The following test was written by Guido Gruner from the Unemployment Self-Help Oldenburg. Life situation and experiences in labor migration have many facets. People see what they see depending on where they look and what they look at. What migration really means for migrants is somewhere between the thesis of the freedom of migration and the statement of a person affected. I would have to be a pig to earn good money as a migrant in the food industry, but I'm not, and I don't want to be. We experience many things in our consultation and encounters. For this contribution, a look at the health consequences for the workers in the German meat industry was required. We see how destructive work is in an industry that shines on a national and international markets. Destructive, at the same time, physical and psychological stress and work overload of workers and their family members. We meet workers in our counseling services on social and labor law, wage refusal, lack of health and social insurance, and regarding their experiences at the employment department and job center. We are also asked many questions about pregnancy, and we hear a lot about illness, injuries, and exhaustion. The hardship migrants experience is a consequence of the immense pressure put on them as workers in factories that produce on the basis of the cheap prices. Schneller, schneller, or fertig, fertig are often the first German words that migrant workers learn when they are driven by foremen. Years ago, a workers' council at the polluter Islet Waters told us about their struggle to stop foremen shouting at the assembly line workers. This year, a worker at this slaughterhouse told us about being humiliated and beaten at work. He and other workers beaten green and blue in the face by the German foreman of a German subcontractor did not even have the intention to report their tormentors to the police. The reason, the idea that they had a right to physical and mental integrity at work in Germany had long been driven out of them. These are the peaks we see in terms of the use of violence against workers and specifically migrant workers. A general characteristic of the situation in the meat industry is the daily wear and tear of the workers. Shift work at high speed and cold, often until all orders accepted by the company have been processed and additional shifts. Some workers work 7 days a week for weeks and months. We know of current examples for industrial cleaning in South Oldenburg. Under this pressure, cruel accidents at work occur. For example, when the workers' arms or legs are cut by cutting machines, or when the knives of belt workers cut them up themselves. The constant threat of dismissal from the very first illness, the usually 6-month probationary period of fixed-term employment contracts, the lack of effective labor law protection, the high hurdles in accessing wage replacement and employment benefit. The official language in is German, it says. The strict exclusion rules for EU citizens in the law for job centers mean that even those who are ill, even against explicit, sometimes urgent medical advice, are forced to appear at work. Even pregnant women continue to work on the assembly lines in fear of being dismissed due to their pregnancy. Protection against dismissal of pregnant women to protect life and health is unknown to many foremen and managers, or is again being ignored to better knowledge. Recently, for example, the Nuremberg Labor Court had to make these protection rules clear to a German manager of a meat processing firm near Diepholz. The manager had previously sovereignly ignored an indication and evidence to it. Against all the rules of the current Working Hours Act, a German industrial cleaner has his workers work the night shift 7 days a week for weeks. Roommates in the accommodation call them zombies, and thus find a term for their condition. Despite this work performance, they do not earn much more than €2,000 net per month. They do not dare to think about sick leave, although their state of exhaustion would certainly justify it. Attention should also be drawn to family members, especially children and young people. Just last week, a schoolgirl from Vecta told me about her tiredness. She is the only one who speaks German. She is always in demand when it comes to contracts with the German-speaking environment, with employers, doctors, schools, job centers, employment agency, health insurance companies, landlords. She works around the clock. She doesn't dare to put the phone down or switch it off. In fact, she is responsible for many people, not just her family. We know of many children and young people in her situation, some of whom are the only 12 years old who understand and speak the language and are able to decipher the writing that is commonly used here. Not only physicians and psychologists will be able to judge that such a childhood and adolescent is not appropriate for children and will have consequences. So what is currently missing? First, equal rights for all, no discriminational treatment of migrants at the job center, employment office, and family department. Second, a real ban on temporary work and work contracts in food production. The following must be applied: one company, one workforce. Third, significantly higher hourly wages. 15 euros per hour should be the minimum. Fourth, effective enforcement of the Protection of Pregnant Women and the Working Time Act. Fifth, schools and children that can also meet the needs of migrant children and youth. Schools and childcare. Sixth, a local, nationwide, independent and party-based counseling and support structure for all migrants without language barriers. Seventh, sufficient, decent and affordable housing. Thanks.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. By these statements and input, we came to the end of the event today.